Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kahata AB Wash Process Kenya from Langora Kaffe. And there's the bag right there. And Langora, based out of Stjørdal, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including in our most recent Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, where we tried this exact coffee. Now, the backstory behind that is I'd actually purchased this bag before we received the Advent Calendar, not expecting Cafe Box to include any of Langora's wash processed coffees, given that Langora tends to focus more on their unique and heavier processed coffees. And that's why I found it funny that not only was this coffee included in the Advent Calendar, but it was actually the first day of the calendar itself. I wasn't going to let that deter us from finishing this review though, so we will see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 36. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And for reference, Langora's recipe is a 16.67:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at boiling temperatures, which is 100 degrees Celsius, about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. I actually like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, it's kind of interesting as this one turned out a little bit more developed than a lot of my previous experiences with this coffee roaster, as I could say that a lot of people would more closely align this with the developed side of a medium light, and you'll see what I mean by that throughout this review. But that did take me by surprise, as I've had some lighter experiences with this coffee roaster. This one just had a little bit more development to it than those. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and the cup was mostly in line with expectations, as it did offer an abundance of the bright Kenyan characteristics with a slight bit of this vanilla-like attribute as well. A fair bit of sweetness leading to an overall positive start. We continue on to day 15, opted for the Chemex, and this resulted in a little bit more faint of a result, as the abundance of brightness was still present with a little less definition of the flavor profile itself outside of what was a pretty notable acidity. Lingering citrus followed by a lively bright berry. So this was another okay day, but we continue on to day 17, opted for the April brewer, and there was a slight bit more smokiness than previously experienced, as it was offering slightly more of a robust version of a Kenyan profile with more of the slightly smoky berry component as well as a strong herbal florality. So this was just an okay day, and that's kind of what I was alluding to at the start, and it was an experience I'd had from the first couple of days. I said there's an ever so slight smoky quality, and it's really on this day I said, okay, it's definitely present and it's a little bit more pronounced than I might have expected otherwise. We continue on to day 20 through the V60 with Langora's recipe, and the cup continues to remain pretty consistent, as it is offering a fair bit of the traditional unexpected Kenyan characteristics, that of course being the bright tart berries and the citrus, with a little bit of some red florals and the slight savoriness to complement all of those things, as well as a slight bitterness to what was otherwise a very long-lasting finish within the cup. Still consistent in that sense. We continue on to day 25 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's slightly different as it had this graham cracker-like sweetness to complement the Kenyan brightness to the cup. Still a fair bit of the slightly smoky and robust aspect of this cup with plenty of body, even through the Chemex. So there are some trade-offs about this one, but I'm still continuing to experience a fair bit of the smoky qualities to it. Day 26, back to our standard recipe, and there were some subtle differences with the adjustments, as once again it had that slight graham cracker-like sweetness. So I think that's one thing that really opened up with a little bit more time within this coffee. It has become quite well pronounced, and it is my favorite part of this coffee too, as it offered something a little different relative to a lot of the experiences you have with Kenyan coffees. Brightness still present, but a little bit more toned down, as the classic Kenyan characteristics are very prominent, but it is relatively subdued with a slight tart and citric berry attribute to it. Day 29 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and you can feel a little bit more in the cup now, as it starts to seem pretty tame but clean, just cleaner in general, as most of the cup is present upon its cool down. Like a lot of the best characteristics of it do improve once this cup is cooling down. A little bit more of a darker stone fruit aspect was also present, so something along the lines of like a plum. And it was reminiscent of that, as well as the listed vanilla, as there was this vanilla cookie pie crust like attribute to it. Just a fair bit of depth to an otherwise pretty moderate coffee. And then day 32, final notes, we have one more try with our same recipe, and the cup does seem to have settled pretty well, as at this point it's been pretty consistent, though for the most part Kenyan coffees tend to be pretty consistent, as there's a slight bit more candied sweetness to the cup. It continues to offer a fair bit of this slight vanilla cookie-like aspect, with plenty of the Kenyan characteristics, that of course being the tart berry brightness, a fair bit of citrus, and an overall pretty straightforward cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We will start with the cleanliness, level 4. And that's kind of interesting, and I'm wondering why I put it there at that level 4. I think that's going to be pretty generous for this coffee, and I think when I was making this tasting wheel, I was actually thinking that as well. That's probably a pretty generous score for this coffee. If I had to go off what I'm drinking right now, I would say that the main reason I'm getting that level 4 is because it doesn't really offer an abundance of savoriness. Like, the tomato-like attribute isn't really that strong, and a lot of the cup is well defined. I think the only thing that's kind of holding me back is the smoky quality to it, though it looks like when I made this tasting wheel, I had the smoky quality downgraded ever so slightly. As I'm looking at this, I'm kind of surprised by the way that this tasting wheel looks already. Cleanliness, we'll say lower side of level 4. If it was me making this tasting wheel right now, I would actually put it at that level 3. Finish, level 4. That part, as I always say when it comes to Kenyan coffees, they do tend to have a fair bit of a lasting finish to them, so anytime it doesn't score a 4, that's something worth noting. Otherwise, level 4 seems about right. Acidity, level 4. Once again, we're working with a Kenyan coffee, so I always expect those two things to reach a minimum, level 4. And this one definitely had a fair bit of brightness to it right from the onset, so that's in line with what I was expecting on this one. Berry fruit, level 4. No surprises there whatsoever, as there's so many of those tart berry aspects to it, as it is classic Kenyan profile in that sense, so I don't have too much to add to that. We'll start with the level 3s now, and we'll go through the body first, and that being at that level 3, once again, we're working with a Kenyan coffee through the V60, and I don't really have too much to add to that, as it has that classic juicy Kenyan body, just a little bit more texture in general to it. So level 3, pretty fitting for that. Sweetness, level 3, and as I'm drinking it on this day, I can say maybe the slightly higher side of the level 3. Maybe my thinking when making this tasting wheel was a little bit of a trade-off, keep the sweetness a little lower and keep the clarity a little higher. Though truth be told, both of those are probably best at a 3.5. And I think I just kind of sacrificed the sweetness, as it's not necessarily the sweetest Kenyan coffee we've reviewed. Florality, level 3. Once again, there's that hibiscus-like attributes to it, though interestingly, I wouldn't say it's quite as pronounced as it has been in a number of other coffees, Kenyan coffees we've reviewed, so I felt it fitting to leave it there at that level 3 mark. Citrus fruit, level 3. And once again, at times it can feel like a little bit of an undefined citric component to it, and that's just what I was experiencing with this one right here. So that's why it's stuck there at that spot. Stone fruit, level 3. As I kind of mentioned, some darker stone fruit aspects, most specifically and distinctly some plum attributes, so that's why that's there at that level 3 mark. And then I think the final thing worth discussing is that smokiness, because as I've already said, I disagree with my placement of it on this tasting wheel, though it feels like it might have ramped up ever so slightly on this day. If there's anything I do have to say, it's probably on the higher side of level 2, and maybe if I was really pushing it, it could be on the lower side of that level 3, but it's at least at a level 2, so I'm not entirely sure why that's charted right there. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I actually disagree with it quite a bit, but for the most part, it's a decent representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like in the past I've actually said before that I do have a slight soft spot for slightly more developed Kenyan coffees, because it does seem to kind of tone down the tomato-like attributes, and I can get this very interesting sweetness from them. And while this one right here had a little bit more of a developed quality than I might have expected for it, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan, because it still offered an abundance of the classic Kenyan attributes while still having this nagging smoky quality that also mirrored those things. So the combination of factors wasn't overly ideal for me, though I did find some nice positives, most specifically in terms of that vanilla-like attribute, that sweetness, that pie crust and cookie sweetness that was present within this one. Definitely the best part of me for it on this, but I would still say not necessarily my Kenyan type of person I would suggest this coffee to. First place I would have to start is, of course, roast profile on this one, because given that this is a Nordic coffee roaster, I think a lot of people might go into this one expecting a super light coffee, and I was, and that's why I was surprised. So keep that as your first starting point. It's not necessarily going to be the lightest coffee. And once you start out with that. Then from there, you can go on to what you're looking for, specifically those Kenyan qualities, as this one had all of those in abundance, those classic tart berries, the acidity, the long-lasting finish, and a slight bit of savoriness, but for the most part, skewing a little bit more in terms of that florality as well. So some really nice characteristics to pick up from this one, and I think that's kind of the best way I could leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here is a review of the Kahata AB Wash Process Kenya from Langora Kaffe. Thank you for watching.